Global financial crisis. Are we at the end or beginning? To gain insight into this, I'm going to refer to a pattern of sustainable progress. It's in fact a universal pattern that is very well summarized in the journey of a seed becoming a flower. So let me illustrate this journey. We have a seed. It gives rise to some tendril structure and then finally culminates in a flower. So when we look at this journey in more detail, it's characterized by three phases. The first phase is where you have the seed, which is a distinct, isolated entity that doesn't change much, so there's minimal change, and it likes to keep the status quo. Once this seed germinates, it gives rise to this tendril and root structure, so there's a lot of growth, but this growth can often be irrational. So it's experimental growth that's irrational, and there's a lot of aggressiveness in this growth. And then finally, there's a third stage where you have the hidden meaning that was in the seed becoming clear. So you have the flower, which is the culmination of this journey, and that indicates a kind of comprehensiveness. There's meaning and there's purpose that becomes apparent. And let me refer to these three stages. The stage of comprehensiveness, of meaning, of purpose as the mental phase. This phase of aggressiveness, experimentation, often irrational growth as being the vital phase. And this stage of seeking to maintain the status quo and minimal change as being the physical phase. Now, when we relate this to global financial activity, what I'm going to do is I'm going to graph this out so that on one axis we really have these three phases, and the point being that this is a pattern of sustainable progress. It's a universal pattern. And so if we are at the end of the global financial crises, what we should be seeing is a pattern which is going certainly from the vital to the mental. So that's one axis. The second axis, we're going to plot the timeline. And the first question I'm going to ask is, where is financial theory, or where does it exist? And if we look at this, what we'll be forced to conclude is that it really does exist at the mental level. So we have financial theory that animates markets that's based on primarily efficient market hypothesis that states that financial markets are informationally efficient. Prices of any assets include all the information in the markets, everything about competition, everything about all the players, about supply and demand, all that is summarized in the price of an asset. And that's what really animates the theory behind financial transaction and markets. When we look at the actual reality of what's happening in markets, we see that in fact we have a reality, an operational reality, which is driven not so much by this comprehensive thought that's captured in efficient market hypothesis, but by this dynamic of fear and greed that really is aggressive, irrational, which is something at the vital level. The reason why I place these at different points is because they came into existence at different points in time. So we have the efficient market hypothesis that was conceptualized, or that was summarized around 1950. And if we consider where we are today, 2010, then we are definitely at this level in the operation of financial markets. We weren't always or necessarily at this level. In fact, if you go back to the year 1600, where you had the first stock exchange, this definitely existed at the physical level, and there's been a kind of a trajectory with a inflection point around 1985, where there's a marked acceleration from the physical to the vital. And by the way, this trajectory of growth in itself is like the pattern from here to here, and we're definitely haven't reached here yet. But the point being is that today, when we look at the operation of financial markets, we're here, the theory is here, and what we can see right away is that there's a huge gap. There's what I'd call a bubble, because this bubble is really responsible for the destruction of financial value, because we think we're operating at this level when in fact we're operating at this level. So whether we're looking at any kind of housing crisis or investments flowing into any emerging markets or whatever it might be, we're not really at this level. We're operating here. So there's a huge disparity, and this is captured in bubbles, and what we've been seeing is the existence of these huge bubbles. So unless these bubbles are removed, so that in effect what we have is the operational reality approaching the theory behind it, we have to see that the global financial crisis is just beginning and not end. And further, if we really think about within this mental level, there's several possibilities. We have the efficient market hypothesis, but then I'd also argue that there's something that we need to create called a sustainable market hypothesis. And if we consider that bubble, it's even bigger, because here we have, while this bubble is related to the destruction of financial value, this bubble here is related to the destruction of environmental and social value. And we have a yet bigger bubble, which I'll call the purpose-driven market hypothesis, which encompasses these other bubbles. So even if we were to solve this bubble and this bubble, we still exist in a third bubble, which is misaligned with the purpose that a fractal or a pattern for sustainable progress gives us insight into. So are we at the beginning or end of financial crises? I would say that based on this analysis, we are definitely at the beginning, because we first have to burst this bubble, the destruction of financial value, which we haven't done yet. We then have to burst this bubble, the destruction of environmental and social value, which encompasses this, and then we have to burst this bubble. So we still have a ways to go before we really are at the end of any financial crisis. And in order to get there, what it means is that these theories have to sync up with the reality, so that the theories become much more meaningful. So there has to be a shift from this aggressiveness and experimentation that drives financial value today, so that it is actually driven by a sensible market hypothesis, which it's not driven by today. So unless that gap is compressed, we are at the beginning and not at the end of any financial crisis. So by the way, this analysis and a lot more is covered in this book, Redesigning the Stock Market, which has been published by Sage Publications and in fact came out only about 2 weeks ago.